So I've got a bunch of slides. We also have a demo I'm going to do. So copy the slides is here. So I'll throw this link into the chat again. There you go. So feel free to grab a copy of the slides if you'd like. All right, so let's get basic here. Drupal sites basically are composed of three things, right? There's code, all the PHP, JavaScript code, that's, YAML files, all the code that's stored in a repo, a database, and a files directory. And the files directory is for all of our cat pictures that we attach to all of the, news articles that we post. But let's focus on the database. When we go and we add a new article or a new basic page and we fill out that form and we hit save, the title, the body, all of that stuff gets stored in the database. Similarly, when we go to views and build it out a new view and we add filters and formats and fields and hit save on that view configuration also gets stored in the database. So really, the Drupal database is storing two different types of data, content and configuration. And for the most part, there are some tables that store content and there are some tables that store configuration. But it's not like it's a clear delimiter. It's not like you can look at the Drupal database and all the configuration tables begin with, config underscore. It's kind of all mixed in there, and it's dynamic. Because as you create new fields, new content types, behind the scenes, Drupal is creating new tables in your database. So the database ends up being this big amalgamation of content and configuration. So that's, number one thing we have to be aware of. Number two thing is best practices for developers. If you're building a Drupal site for, your organization, for yourself, for a client, the best practice is really that you should be building it on your local. You should be making all of your changes on your local. And when everything looks good on your local, you commit it to your repo, and it goes up to maybe a dev environment or a QA environment or a staging environment or a test environment, whatever you want to call those environments. It goes up to some shared development environment so that maybe other stakeholders can check out what you did and sign off on it. And then ultimately, your changes should be pulled into the live environment. That's, acme.com or whatever it is. So I use this slide in pretty much all of the classes that I teach. I always find a reason to show it because I think having a good developer workflow is really the foundation of doing just about anything in Drupal. And this is how I represent a simple developer workflow. Now, we're not going to talk about continuous integration, continuous development. We're going to keep things simple for this type of workflow. Single repository, a bunch of environments in the middle. So up top, we have our production environment. That's, acme.com. Maybe there's a test, a QA staging environment. Maybe there's a dev environment. Maybe even there's like one dev environment per branch of your code. And at the very bottom is your local development environments. If you're on a team of 3 people building out the site, then there's going to be 3 local development environments. Let's focus on the left side first. Notice that there's only one way to get code into a remote Git repository, and that's through local. So what is that telling us? And this is all process-based, right? I mean, you can do whatever you want. You can, rearrange this diagram and put arrows everywhere if you want. But this diagram really, demonstrates what I consider a best practice for a solid developer workflow. And the idea is that changes to the site should only be done on local. And I'm not talking about content changes. I'm talking about configuration changes. You make your change on local. Maybe it's even a code change. Maybe you add a new module, but you do that on local first. You test it on local. If everything looks good, then you push into your remote repository. So the fact that there's no arrow going into your repository from dev, test, or production is no accident. It's basically saying you shouldn't be adding a new module for the first time on production, right? You should be doing that here, pushing that into the repo, pulling it into here to test, pulling it into here to have other folks test. And once everybody signs off, then you pull it into production. So that's code flowing up. On the other side is kind of like our content side. And this is, let's say, part of the database, right? Because we know the database has content and configuration in it. And content files. These are all of our cat photos. And once your site is live, the idea is that you should never be taking like a dev database and copying it up to production, because you're likely going to lose data. If someone just joined the site, 20 minutes ago on your prod site, and here you are right now copying the database from dev to prod, you're basically overriding the user table at that point, and you're deleting that user. So this is the data flows downside. So whenever we're thinking about a solid development workflow, it's code flows up and data flows down. Now, what does this have to do with the configuration system? Well, pretty much everything, because as we said before, a Drupal database has our configuration, but we are not allowed to take configuration in the database from local and copy it up, copy that database up, because that goes against this diagram. Really, the only way we can get configuration moved up is if we take it out of the database and somehow put it in the repo. And that's really what the configuration system is all about. The configuration system is all about taking configuration out of the database, turning it into files of some type, committing it to the repo, then pulling that configuration in to each environment. So far, so good? No questions yet? All right, very good. I'm gonna keep on rolling. All right, so with configuration of the database, obviously, like I just said, we can't copy a local database up to live in order to move configuration, right? Because we'll overwrite content. So let's say production is just humming along. I'm working on my local. Last time I got a copy of the prod database was a week ago, and I'm tasked with creating a new content type. So off I go on my little local, and I'm adding a new content type, adding 13 fields, getting everything configured, and looks good to me. But all of that configuration is in my database. So if I was allowed, I would copy that database up to dev. But I might be overriding some content or some other configuration on dev. So I can't do that. So I have to somehow get all of that information about that content type over here into the repo. Something else that folks have played around with and tried to do, and I've seen it, I've been in Drupal for 14 years-ish. And I've seen it. I've seen folks try and do it. I've seen it work sort of. And that's to basically, identify exactly which tables in the database contain configuration and just move those. Rather than copying the entire database, well, let's just copy, 8 or 10 tables up. The problem with that is, and the reason why I say it's not practical, it's not impossible, but it's not really practical because there's so many interdependencies between tables in a Drupal database, especially involving configuration. So it's often, much more difficult to do that than just to embrace the configuration system. So in short, Drupal 8's, and I should say Drupal 8 and 9's, and I'll be using Drupal 9 today. Drupal 8 and 9's configuration system provides a mechanism to export configuration from the database into code in the form of YAML files. Once it's in code, we can use Git to move it between environments. All right, so we're going to take configuration that's on our local database. We're going to export that to code. And then once it's code, we can git, add, commit, push, and get it in here. So this is what the diagram looks like. And for me, if all you get out of today is this diagram makes sense, then you're in good shape. And we're going to come back to this a few times, but let's kind of go through it the first time. So here we are on our local. This is our local Drupal 8 database, right? Just living down here, and I'm going to use DDev today, but maybe using Lando, maybe using WAMP, MAMP, AquaDev Desktop, whatever. This is your local database. There is a way to export configuration from the UI. I'm not going to use it today. I'm going to stick with Drush because I think that's a best practice. And I think it just makes a lot more sense to use Drush than use the UI. So I'll show you the buttons on the UI, but we're not going to use them. And I would recommend that you just get used to using the Drush commands. So there's a command called drush config export. And what does that do? That basically takes all the configuration in this database and turns it into YAML files and puts it into a directory that you specify. So this is actually a fairly simple command, because all this is really doing is a SQL query. And then for each table, it's literally taking the data in the table, converting it from a serialized PHP array to YAML, and sticking that data into a YAML file. So we're actually, we'll go through this slowly in a couple minutes. Well, as part of the example. Once it's YAML, git add and commit to local. Right, so now it's in our local Git repository. Then we can push it up to the remote repository. Right, so at that point, our new content type is floating around over here in the remote Git repository. Well, then we can pull those YAML files in to dev. Right, we can do a git pull and pull those new YAML files into the the configured config directory on the remote in the remote environment. But we're not done at that point, because by default, and in pretty much every Drupal site I've ever seen, although it is configurable, Drupal doesn't care about your YAML files. When Drupal's running and Drupal's looking for configuration information, it's looking for the database. When you load, a view, and that view needs to, when you go to edit a view and all the configuration of your view shows up on that edit page, all of that data is coming out of the database. It's not coming out of the YAML files. So we have a config import command, which basically reads all of these YAML files and moves them, moves all that configuration into the database. Now, this is a lot more difficult of a task than exporting, right? Because on export, it's just some SQL query and some PHP write statements. But on import, think about what has to happen here. Let's say there's a new content type buried in all of this YAML. If we just take that configuration, import it, and stick it in the database, okay. But when you create a new content type with new fields, there have to be new tables generated. So this config import not only has to read the YAML and stuff it into the database, it also has to act on that YAML sometimes. Your configuration could include enabling a new module. Well, if you just, and that's basically just a flag in here. If all config import did was copy that flag from here to here, so what? Config import is smart enough to see, oh, this is a flag that's enabling a module. So now I actually have to enable the module and run hook install on that module and all that good stuff. So config import is kind of this is the one that does most of the work. But ultimately, once you run the config import, your config is now in this remote database, and your content type is now available, on your dev site, for example. So we're going to kind of go through this process. We're going to follow it every step of the way, including configuring everything. That's kind of our big example for today. Okay. Any questions yet? So far, so good. All right. I don't see any questions, so I'm just going to keep it on. I'm going to grab a sip of water here.
I was thinking.
All right. So let's start configuring things a little bit. So I basically have a fairly fresh Drupal 9 install. I actually just updated it yesterday, so it has a security update from Wednesday and everything. It's got a little bit of content, literally one node. It has the admin toolbar module. There's some other modules in the code base, but nothing's enabled right now. So it's a pretty vanilla Drupal 9 site. I also have my command line up and going, and I also have BB edit open because we're going to need to modify a file in a second. So the first thing we have to do is we want to tell the configuration system where we want this sync directory to live. Right? So remember, that sync directory is when we run config export, that's where all of our YAML files go. When we run config import, that's where config import is looking for all of our YAML files. So if you use the Drupal core recommended composer template that comes with, that's part of Drupal core, you're going to get a nested doc root. So your site's going to look something like this. And I know that this screen, that the font's a lot smaller than the rest, but we're going to have to just deal with that. So here's the Drupal 9 site, and really Drupal 9 lives inside the web directory over here. So it's a nested doc root. So when you have a nested doc root, since the config files, they don't need to be exposed, in any way, shape, or form, via a path in the web browser, you can actually put the config files somewhere in the project root. So that's pretty much what we're going to do. We are going to, let me come back down here. There we go. We're going to configure the sync directory to be in the project root. And you can do that in your settings.php file. And if you are, so that's the file I have open here, settings.php. Hopefully your site started with the default settings.php and just copied that as a starter for your settings.php. If so, you get all this great documentation and stuff like that. But somewhere in here, just got to find it. There we go. There's a section called location of the site configuration files. So you can uncomment this, and it's recommended it's outside the web root, which is exactly what we're going to do. So we're basically going to say, go up one directory and put it in config. So that directory doesn't exist yet. Notice there's no config directory right here. But the first time we do an export, Drupal will go ahead and create this directory for us. So this is super important. Keep in mind that starting with, I think, and someone feel free to correct me or tell me if I got it right or wrong, somewhere around 8.6, the way this was configured changed. I think it used to be a $config thing, but now it's a settings variable. So just be careful if you're using a newer, depending on your version of Drupal core, just make sure you have this correct. And it's actually safe to do it both ways as well. And actually, what's funny about this? Actually, since I'm using ddev, if you look at the settings.ddev file, they actually document this really well. Yeah. So before 8.8, it was config directories. For 8.8 and 8.9, they recommend using the new way of doing it. And for 9 and higher, they recommend the new way of doing it. So as long as you're above 8.8, just go ahead and do it this way, and you'll be fine. All right, and that's really all the settings that we need. Now, something to note: the configuration system is all or nothing. This is not like features back in Drupal 7. Show of hands, how many people are familiar with features in Drupal 7? Yeah, okay. So question, I usually see the directory set to config sync and sometimes put config as Right. Some people like to have, rather than, and it's what I'm doing here is not the be all and end all. This is just where I normally put it. I have definitely, I'm actually on projects where people set it up like this. I believe the default, or it used to be some, I don't know if it, I don't even know. Well, maybe actually DDEV, I think, has it by default there. Yeah. Let me go back to that. This addresses the other part of Jamie's question. Notice DDEV by default puts it in the files directory. I don't really agree with that. I think if you have a nested doc root, you should definitely put it above the doc root. So there's not really a huge, let me put it this way. Most of the time, there's not a security risk. There are a few contrib modules out there, though. And it's escaping me. Maybe by the end of the hour, I'll remember. But I know I can think of at least one contributed module that, as part of the configuration, you have to enter a password for like an API, and it stores that password in clear text in your configuration YAML file. So as Matt just typed, that can be a security risk.
Yeah, I can
So
think of at least one that does that.
what's that?
Yeah, I can definitely think of at least one that does that. Not off the top of my head, it's something for email. It might be SendGrid. That there's like a key that it stores in the configuration.
Right,
For sure.
right. So
Yeah.
best practice, absolutely. If you have a nested doc root, get it above the doc root.
I agree with that. I only mentioned that because I've seen when you run the setup, I'm sorry, the install.php, it seems to do it in the files directory, which I don't like, but you can change it afterwards for security.
Good to see you, Jamie, by the way. How's it
You
going?
do. You too.
All right. Okay, question from Luke. I'll decide if I'm going to answer it later. Thank you very much, Luke. Now, since you can't export less than a full dump, how do you merge feature branches? Yeah, let's save that one. Let's definitely save that one for later, Luke. Okay, so back to the slide. I was talking about features in Drupal 7. With features in Drupal 7, you got to pick what was in that feature. You got to say, I want this content type in this feature. I want this view in that feature. I want this text format in that feature. Drupal 8.9 configuration system does not work that way. It's all one big feature. I'll say by default, there's no way to split it up into many different features. And one of the reasons why is, the community actually started going down that route. When Drupal 8 was, being developed, the problem is there's too many interdependencies. This configuration depends on this configuration, depends on that configuration. And a content type with a field is a great example, because you have the field instance configuration that's dependent on the field base configuration, as well as on the content type configuration. And if you have a view that is filtering by content type, or filtering, by the value of a field, then that view is dependent on that field, which is depending on the base, which is depending on the content type. So it gets very complex very quickly. So the folks who built the configuration system said, nope, all or nothing. So what does that mean? When you do a config export, you don't pick and choose which configuration. You export all the configuration for your site into YAML files. When you do an import, you're not, picking and choosing. You're importing all of the configuration in. Okay, let me see. Can you left content type config exports and carry the YAML over your custom module for Stone? Can you lift? Yeah, but it's not super straightforward. Let me put it that way, Will. There are you can export, you can take an exported configuration and pull it into a fresh site. There's actually a module that does that, config install. Actually, I think that might even be in core now that I think about it. I've never done, I don't think I've ever needed to do what you're describing, where you build a content type, it's in core config, but then you want to move it out of core config and put it like in your custom module. I think you could probably, I'm just trying to think it through how I would do it. You definitely would want to put it in the config install directory of your custom module. And I think you would have to remove the UUID from those configs. I think that the UUID, I think, is going to be the key there. And Matt, does it work the way as I described? Did I miss any big steps? Matt said he's actually done that.
Sorry, I was muted. It worked for me. I didn't use the UUID. I had to make a module that when it installed, it sent a block to a theme region, and I couldn't figure out how else to do it other than with that config install. And I figured that the easiest way to generate the YAML for it was to export it. And what I did was not a configuration full export, but in the UI, there is the configuration single export. Yep. Which you'll get to that, I suppose. Yep. That's what I did, and I was able to get that to work in a module exactly as you described.
All right, perfect. Good. Okay, so here, let me get to the demo, and I'm sure we'll have more questions as we get there. So a standard Drupal install, which is what we have, has about 200 configuration files. Now, granted, on this site, I've got just, I think, admin toolbar. I don't know if I don't think I have any extra content types yet. I know I have media enabled, obviously. And this has, well, I haven't done an export yet, but I know it's going to have somewhere around 225 configuration files. And that's before we've really started doing anything. So there's a lot of config files. Especially when you're just getting your feet underneath you or your legs underneath you. What's the right analogy there? When you're just getting going with the configuration system, I would stick to, not trying to import, export subsets through the UI. Once you kind of understand where the interdependencies are and you take baby steps, I think it's okay. But until you get some muscle memory and some knowledge built up, experience built up, stick with the way it's meant to be, all or nothing. Okay, so let's do a demo, and really basically just going to do this. So I've got a site here, and I'm not even going to make any changes to it. I've got a site, it's installed, it's got a node, whatever. But so all the configuration for the site is in here. All right, and just as a quick little example, let's go to configuration. I'm going to pick the easiest configuration bit I can. And that is on the basic site settings. Obviously, my site title is Drush site install, because I use Drush to site install it, but the site name. So this is just one bit of configuration that we're going to kind of track through this. Whoops. So I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to actually go into my container so I can just run Drush commands cleanly. All right. So let's just do, everything's cool here, Drush status. So let's go ahead and do a Drush config export. All right, so remember what config export does. It's basically going to take all the configuration from here and write it out to YAML files. And it tells us it did. Configuration successfully exported to config / oh, I guess I didn't remove that sync. Yeah, all right. So, well, we are using config.sync. And if we look, we now have a config directory, a sync directory, and a pile of files. Yeah, 225. So I even practiced this demo. All right, so let's do this. Let me ddev SQL Pro. Let's look at the database. One second to bring this window over. Sorry. Put it over here. All right, so here's the database, and lo and behold, there's a config table. And there's 224 records. Now, why isn't it 225? Well, it's close enough. We don't count htaccess. Right? So basically, all of the configuration is stored inside of our config table. All right, so all 224 files. And even gets, even more organized than that. If let's do a quick search for system, not equals, contains system. There is system dot site. All right, so we're going to focus on this little system dot site record, or row, I should say. Well, same thing. System dot site. And if we open this up in BB Edit, it looks like this. Right, and you can see here's the site name, the mail and some other stuff. If we look at the record in the database, this is serialized PHP array, but sure enough, there is the site name. There is the email address for the admin. So really, when we run config export, it's a select star from config. And then for each row, take the name of the config, create a new file, .yaml, and inside that file, take this data, unserialize it, and output it as YAML. And that's literally all that the config export command does. These are all just records from the config table. So that's really easy. That's really sweet. That's what we want. We want simple, easy, sweet, and easy to understand. Absolutely. So config export. And now we've got a pile of YAML files. So now that we have a pile of YAML files, let's come over to configuration, development, config sync. This is all part of core. I'm going to open that up in a new tab. And this is going to tell us that there's no configuration changes to import. So what does this mean? And so I'm on the Synchronize tab. This basically means that what's in the database, the contents of this table exactly match the contents of this directory. That's what this means. Now, if I come into basic site settings and I say lunch and learn demo and hit save, what happened? I basically saved this string to the database, right? I haven't done anything with YAML. But if I come to the database and I now look at, let me reload this. And if I look at system.site down here, sure enough, lunch and learn demo. So definitely got saved to the database. And, obviously if I go to, the home page, this is, obviously the configuration that's going to be in use is right there, lunch and learn demo. So what happens if I come over to my YAML files and look at that, the same file, system site, it still has the old one, Drush site install. Drush site install. Why? Well, because of what we've been talking about this whole time is configuration lives in here. It's used in here. This is what's called the active config. The only way to get, active config into YAML files is through this command. So, oops. Let's come back over here. Now that we've made a change, let's reload this page. Now, first of all, I will tell you, these warning messages can be misleading. So the best advice I can give you is to ignore them. Ignore these messages and just focus what's going on down here. So we have a change, right? And it's in the system.site configuration, and we can view differences. Now, what's view differences telling us? Well, it's basically going to compare the configuration in here with the configuration in here and show us what the differences are. So it should make sense. We kind of know what to expect here. In our active configuration, which, translate this in your head to database, active configuration equals database. We have lunch and learn demo. That's what we expect. We just changed it on the site. We saved it. Active configuration means database. Staged configuration, translate this to YAML files. So this is what's in the database. This is what's in YAML. So now on this page, we have this button called import all. Now, import all is basically the same thing as config import. So forget about this, being on a remote right now, but config import is going to read the YAML from, our config sync directory and import it into our database. So if we run config sync, we're going to take the data in this YAML file and put it into the database. And the net result of that is we're going to lose our change. We're going to overwrite our change. So let's do that. Drush, oops. Let me clear that. Drush config import. And it looks like it's only doing one, but it's only doing one because config import does the same thing that config sync page does. It looks to see which ones have changed. And there's only one that's changed, so it only lists one. Do we want to import the listed config changes from YAML to the database? Sure, why not? All right, so now if we come back here, reload this page, everything's synced up. If we look here, this is still Drush site install. If we look in the database, this has gone back to Drush site install. If we reload, well, pick a page, this page, it's back to Drush site install. It's back to Drush site install, which means we have lost our change. Now, our change was minor. Our change was just the site name. Easy to fix, right? But imagine that you did that and you had 3 new content types and 14 new views that you hadn't exported to YAML first. If they don't exist anywhere else, if you don't have a database backup, they're gone. So config import is definitely the more dangerous of the 2 commands. All right, so far so good? Okay. And I just realized one thing I didn't set up, but we're gonna fake it here. I don't have my remote set up for this, but that's okay. We'll just work on local for today. Okay, so we did that, did that. Okay, now I want to do some more stuff over here. All right, so let's go ahead and let's make this change again. All right, so we've made that change in the database. We have the same change here, the same diff there. But let's say we like this change. We want to keep this change and we want to get this change into the repo where we can pull it into remote repositories. Well, that's Drush config export, right? The simpler of the 2 commands. Again, we're just taking what's in the database and we're overriding, we're basically exporting all those YAML files and sticking them in here, overriding any that already exist. So when we run Drush config export, we're actually going to get a little warning. The YAML files in your export directory will be deleted and replaced with the active config, meaning this one specifically is going to change. So keep in mind, as of right now, it has Drush site install. If I do this, it's now Lunch and Learn demo. So we have Lunch and Learn demo in the YAML. We have Lunch and Learn demo in the database. And we reload this and we're all good to go. So far, so good. Where am I? Okay, let's see. Yeah, so the configuration synchronization page, basically ignore warning text. But let's focus on this page a little bit more. So let's say I'm going to make a manual change here to my YAML files, which, if you're careful, you can do it. And here, we'll add a slogan. This is the new slogan because I'm super creative like that. All right, so now we've changed the YAML. If we come here, similar thing. In the database, we have no slogan, right? And that's accurate. We haven't changed anything in the database. We just changed the YAML file. So in the database, we have no slogan. In the staged environment, we now have a slogan. If we config import, we're going to take the slogan and bring it into the database. If we config export, we're going to bring this string and put it in the YAML, thus overriding this one. So let's just do a config import again. Where are we on time? 47. Okay, so oops, didn't mean to close that, but here, I'll just reload this and you'll see the slogan in there now. All right, so again, we're just taking baby steps, but you might eventually, and this is kind of an extreme example, you might get to the point where, you're pushing and pulling configuration from multiple developers, and one day you go to your synchronized page and you see something like this. You see, not only do you see changed, like the one we've been dealing with so far has been a change, but you might see some that are new and some that are removed. Now on the synchronization page, new and removed are confusing at best, let's say. So what I hear is, or the way I look at this is, if I do a config import, then I will have 2 new, 169 changed, and 25 removed. So the change ones aren't that difficult to understand. It's a configuration that already existed and someone just modified it, just like we did with the site name and site slogan. But new and removed, new configuration is basically, let's say it's a 3-person team and someone else on your team created a new view. Then they exported their configuration, and then they committed it, pushed it to the repo, and you pulled it in, and suddenly you've got a new view configuration. That's going to show up as new, even though it's not on your site yet, right? So new and removed are referring to the YAML files. I always think of it as, if I do a config export, the results will be 2 new, 169 changed, 25 removed. So if someone adds a new view, you pull it in and you come to the synchronized page, you should expect to see 1 new, right? If someone deleted a content type that had, 5 fields and they committed that configuration change and you pulled that configuration change in, that might mean that you now have 25 fewer configuration files. So, you might have, before you do the, let me get rid of that. Before you do the config import, you might have 25 records in here that have to do with some content type. Well, some other developer deleted that content type and they committed their changes. So there's 25 less files in here, but you still have those 25 records in here. When the import is done, you're going to lose 25 configuration records from your database because it's all or nothing. It's not a merge. It's not like these YAML files are read and then merged with what's in here. Config import, one of the first thing it does is delete all of these. It truncates your config table, and then it reads all of these files in. Yeah, the content type will absolutely be deleted as a result. And if you still have, and it even goes farther than that, Jamie, because if you, I see there's some other questions. I'll chat, I'll get to your question in a second. If on your local, if you have nodes that stem from that content type, the configuration systems are going to say, nope, I cannot delete this configuration because entities exist of this type. So you'll first have to go into your local, delete all nodes of type whatever, and then you'll be able to import the configuration. If fields are removed from configuration, is the data left in the database orphan? No. Nope. When you do a config import, Drupal does what it needs. Think of it this way. Let's say, here, let me just do this real quick. I'm going to create a new content type real quick. Add content type. I love the Internet Movie Database, so we're just going to do movie. Add that. And let's just add a field. We'll do an integer field, or to go number, the integer year of release. Nice and simple, right? Save it. Save everything. All right, so in my database now, oh, that's media. Where am I going? Content, node field. There we go. All right, so I have a node. I know it's really small. I apologize. It says node field year of release. So this is the table where all of my, my value, my years are stored. Think of it this way. If you were to go in and delete, let's say, you create 30,000 nodes, you populate them, if you were to come in here and delete this field, that triggers an operation behind the scenes with Drupal. That not only does it remove this field from this content type, but Drupal's going to clean up after itself and remove this table, and there's a revision one as well. It's going to delete both of those tables. The same operation that Drupal uses when you delete this field, Drupal uses when that configuration is removed. So I think that answers the question. Not orphaned, deleted. Yeah. Yep, Jamie's absolutely right there. Yeah, features left orphans in most cases, I think. I don't know if I can safely say all cases, but let's say a lot of them. Yeah, Will, I'm going to talk about that in a second. Where are we on time? We got about 7 minutes left. Man, time flies. Holy cow. Let me get through. I only have a few more slides left here, I think. So part 2 of this, next time we do a lunch and learn, if I'm invited back, I think I've behaved myself for the most part. It will focus on 3 things basically. These 2 modules, config read only and config split, which from what I see in my experience, these are probably 2 of the more popular configuration related contrib modules. As well as I will set up a remote to go with our local site so we can actually go through this entire cycle as well. So that'll be part 2, should we get there. Config ignore, yeah. I tend to use config split, but I hear you, Matt. We can touch on config ignore as well. All right, I do have some tips and tricks though, and these are all beginner based. And this will maybe be more obvious after part 2, but the configuration read only module or read only mode. So let me just tell you about config read only real quick. Config read only, when you enable it for a particular, and basically you will enable it per environment, right? So maybe you enable it only on production. It basically makes, it doesn't basically make it, oops. It makes it so that you cannot submit any form in the Drupal admin UI that saves to the config table. So you would not be able to go to your production site, log in, come to this page, change the title, and hit this button. There would be a message up here that says the site's in read-only mode, and this button would be grayed out. I refer to this module as the training wheels module for the configuration system. I personally love it. I think it's fantastic. I encourage all of my clients to use it because what does it do? It enforces process. It makes it so that you cannot change configuration on production. It enforces the process. So I personally really like it. Not everybody does, but I like process. So there you go. And I see some questions, so we're gonna I'll get to them in a second. And if I need to stay, I'm happy to stay a couple minutes over if unless I'm getting kicked out. Tips and trick number 2: if you do have to make configuration changes in your live environment, make them, but config export them and commit them to the repo as soon as possible. Because the next person who comes by might not check. They might assume that there are no config changes and do a config import and blow yours away. So when config changes are made to live, get them into the repo as soon as possible. And this becomes more of just a daily process thing. Before working in your local, you're used to doing a git pull, right? Make sure your code's up to date. Well, every time you do a git pull, if you're using the configuration system, you might be pulling in new config. So once you adopt this, and really the configuration system it's more about process than technical things, to be honest. You do a git pull, you should do a git config import because there could be new configuration in every pull you make. Same thing when you're working with multiple branches. When you switch branches, that other branch might have config that your current branch doesn't. So git checkout, whatever, Drush config import. And then before you switch branches, do a config export. Right? So it starts becoming part of your daily cadence with all the git commands you're used to doing. Here's one I find really handy, especially when just reviewing commit messages. If your commit that you're making includes configuration changes, I'd like to see the word config in it. I tend to start config messages with config. And it just, it lets everybody else know that, hey, if you're pulling this in, you need to do a config import. And then well, sometimes it's yellow. In this case, it was, white on gray. That warning text could actually lead you down some rabbit holes. So ignore that and just focus on the change removed in new sections below it. All right, that's all my tips and tricks. So let me look at these questions here.
I was just going to say, thanks, Mike. Chris
Hey,
here.
Chris. Hey.
And, like, obviously this thing will close down. So for anybody that's running out of time and has to jump to a meeting or whatever, just throw it in the Drupal channel to Mike's name and we'll get a thread, and we'll get those questions taken care of too. Thanks again, Mike. Really awesome.
Anytime.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yep, for those of you who have to go, thank you for sticking around. So let me just finish up with these last couple questions. Let's see. I've done cherry picking. Don't see me. Okay, looks like Jamie is just responding to someone else. Luke, looks like we're, but I'm anxious to know if there are any ways to replicate what we used to do with features. When you bring in some configs, not the whole site, but enough that doing them one at a time is a hassle. Does a D8 version of features address this use case? So the D8 version of features has really become what the D7 of features was designed to do, in my opinion. The D7 version of features was not written to do configuration management. It was written to share features, amongst sites. So that if you wanted, if you build a really good slideshow, you can export the configuration for that slideshow and then share it with all of your other sites or put it up on Drupal.org. It was never really meant to be, site-wide configuration management. In Drupal 8, and over time in Drupal 7, features, changes were made that made it easier to use for site-wide configuration management. On Drupal 8, features really went back and refocused on what it's there to do, or what it was originally designed to do, and that is to share features among sites. So I don't use features in Drupal 8, to be honest with you. I just don't have that use case. I think, Luke, the issue that you're getting into, I suspect can at least be partially mitigated by more, and this is not I want to be very careful about the way I say this. I stay out of trouble with stuff like Git and with stuff like features, config system and Git and multiple branches by merging and rebasing often. Right? So what does that mean? I was just working on a project today where I opened up a feature branch. It was 15 days ago and I made some changes. And it involves some configuration. I made my changes. I committed it. I pushed it up to a Pantheon multi-dev environment. And the client just got back to me today. So over 2 weeks. In those 2 weeks, there have been, 8 or 10 commits to the master branch. So literally, the first thing I did today, I got it up and running on my local. I did a git pull on both master, or I did a git fetch. And then I rebased master to make sure my master was up to date. I rebased my feature branch to make sure that was up to date. And then I basically rebased master onto my feature branch. That way my feature branch was up to date, including any new config that came in. And I find that when I do that religiously, and I, and other folks who I work with, do that. And we make sure that we don't get in the situation. And this almost is more of a Git thing than a configuration system thing. When you end up with long running feature branches that don't touch base with the master branch, regularly, that's when you're going to get into trouble, both with Git conflicts and with the configuration system. So that's just my opinion there. So I think that, I don't know if I answered your question, but I think I'm tapped out on knowledge to add to your question or to respond to your question. Oh, Luke's gone. I didn't even see that Luke left. Well, y'all can tell Luke that I answered his question perfectly and he just missed it. All right, that's it. That's all I have. Any other questions? All right. Well, everybody who's left, have a safe weekend. Wear a mask, and have a good Thanksgiving. Those of you that are in the U.S. and celebrate Thanksgiving. So,
Thanks, Mark. And I will say to you that with on the topic of features in Drupal 8, even the features maintainer, if you go to the project page on Drupal.org, there will be a link to an article by the features maintainer that says, "Do not use this to deploy configuration to production. Use config management."
yeah,
So,
yeah.
Old habits die hard, but the features maintainer says don't use features that way.
Yeah, I agree completely because once if you understand the basics, which hopefully we got through today, and you understand, especially config split. Config split is really the thing that I think most people, once they understand config split and can use that effectively, it's game on, I think. So we can cover that.